My wife couldn't believe it when she saw me standing in front of the table, my face illuminated by the soft candlelight, while she tried to hide her astonishment with a shaky smile and a laughable excuse about an after-hours work meeting. She couldn't even hide the panic that flashed in her eyes when she realized that I already knew, that I wasn't there by chance, that my every gesture, from the way I placed my jacket on the chair to the silence that formed before I spoke, carried the weight of something irremediable. But that night, contrary to what she expected, I didn't get up or scream, I didn't break glasses or make a fuss, because everything was already done. Every piece, every move of that emotional chess had already been carefully calculated. I wasn't there as a betrayed man, I was there as someone who had finally regained control of his own story. She tried to get up, tried to smile nervously while saying my name as if we were in a poorly rehearsed play, and I, with the calm that only the certainty of the end brings, replied that I knew. I've known for weeks. She knew about the meetings in hotels disguised as business trips, she knew about the subtly deleted ringtones on her cell phone, the poorly made excuses, the new underwear for no reason, the messages that she thought she had completely deleted. She even knew the dinner time, the restaurant, the wine he would choose for her. And, above all, he knew that she still thought she had control, that she could use seduction to turn betrayal into misunderstanding, that with a kiss on the cheek and a fake tear she would get one more chance. But that night wasn't about chances. It was about closures. And justice. There was no fight, no shouting. There was silence. A deafening silence as I pulled the envelope from my coat pocket and placed it on the table next to the glass of wine that she hadn't even touched. A thick, heavy envelope, like all the evidence inside it. She looked, hesitated, and tried the last resort of a cornered woman, she lied. He said that everything was a misunderstanding, that he was an important client, that if I had waited a little longer, she would have told me everything herself, that she felt alone, that I was distant, that things between us were no longer the same as before. And I listened. I listened with the serenity of someone who had already cried everything they had to cry. Because at that moment, I was no longer a wreck. I was ruin. And there, in the middle of the restaurant, surrounded by curious looks, the lover stood up in silence, visibly disconcerted, as if only then had he understood that he had not only lost a married woman, he had entered a war that he would never be able to win. But what she didn't know, what he could never imagine, is that that betrayal came at a cost much higher than they could pay. And I'm not talking about love, trust, or hurt. I'm talking about justice, calculation, strategy. Because in the weeks I pretended to be the blind husband, the smiling fool, I set the stage for the outcome. I froze accounts. I talked to lawyers. I reviewed clauses in the marriage contract. I mapped the assets that were only in my name. And most importantly, I collected each piece of evidence with the precision of a surgeon. She didn't know it, but her lover wasn't just a stranger, he was an employee of a rival company that, 3 months ago, had been attempting a suspicious merger with mine. Dinner wasn't just a tryst. It was also the final piece of a sordid plan that tried to destroy me professionally. They wanted more than a body. They wanted my name. My legacy. My story. And they failed. That night, in front of curious eyes, I announced the divorce. Not with shouts, but with facts. With a speech as sober as it was devastating. He said she could keep the dinner bill, which was the minimum given the real cost of her choices. He said that the man next to him, who pretended elegance while breaking out in a cold sweat, had lost much more than he imagined. And while they both tried to understand the scale of what had just happened, I left the restaurant with the dignity that she thought she had taken from me. But the real wound, the one they didn't yet know would bleed for a long time, was about to open. What they didn't know, and which would only be revealed in the following days, was that the entire financial structure that supported her lifestyle had been nipped in the bud. Joint accounts closed. Cancelled credit cards. The property in my grandfather's name, which she believed was ours, was never registered jointly. The car she was driving was leased in my name. The only thing she would have was what could fit in a suitcase, and she couldn't even carry that with dignity. Because in the days after that dinner, everything she knew fell apart. Friends moved away. Social reputation evaporated. And the lover? He discovered that he had also been deceived. Because part of the plan included a detailed dossier delivered to his company's HR, showing his involvement with the wife of one of the competitor's main shareholders. Result? Summary dismissal. Ethical process. And scandal. But don't think that this story is all about revenge. Because, after the fire of betrayal, comes reconstruction. And I discovered, among the rubble and emotional wreckage, a new reason to smile. Someone who saw in me not a wounded man, but someone who deserved to be seen. Someone who didn't arrive to fill holes, but to build new paths. And that's when the real story began. Still, what no one, absolutely no one, could imagine was the twist that would happen in the last act. Something that was not planned, that was not in the lawyer's papers, nor in the justice's calculations. A detail, an element as unexpected as it was devastating, that would make everything take on a new dimension. A secret buried among deleted emails, bank statements, and hidden smiles that would put everything I thought I knew in a new light. And it is exactly this secret, revealed at the most unlikely time, that will change the course of history, forever. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and we never support any type of betrayal. All stories told are fiction, but the feelings and consequences they portray are painfully real. Our purpose is clear, to show how betrayal has the power to tear lives apart, destroy families and leave scars that time cannot erase. Get ready, because what you're going to hear now is shocking, intense and unforgettable. Good story. Daniel and Laura have always been the type of couple that attracts attention at parties, dinners, or even in photos on social media, not because of ostentation, but because of the obvious harmony between them. He, a firm-spoken, calm-eyed man, had built his own company from scratch, starting from a small, cramped office and an old computer to become a respected name in the financial sector. Laura, with a degree in public relations, was the type of woman who entered a room and immediately commanded attention with her discreet elegance, always polished, always balanced. She knew how to listen and how to be silent, she knew how to praise without flattering, and she made empathy a kind of native language. The two met while still in college, at a university conference where, curiously, he was just there to accompany a friend and she was the closing speaker. It was an unlikely combination that, little by little, became a solid construction, based on mutual admiration, respect and, above all, patience. The wedding came 5 years later, with a simple ceremony in the countryside and a honeymoon that looked like a European film script, late breakfast overlooking the sea, walks along cobblestone streets, kisses under umbrellas on gray days. For a long time, the two lived as if the world around them could collapse and, even so, they would remain untouched, protected by the invisible bubble of someone who sincerely shares life. There was neither the excess of great passions nor the conformity of lukewarm relationships between them, there was complicity, that which is built with small gestures in everyday life, the note left on the table with a "I'll be back soon," the impromptu lunch on a rainy Tuesday, the comfortable silences on the sofa after a difficult day. The years passed, and with them came important achievements. Daniel expanded his company, hired new talent and became a partner in a large financial holding company. His days began to be filled with long meetings, business trips and decisions that involved millions. Laura, in turn, found stability as an image consultant in a multinational, working directly with the executive sector. His keen eye for detail and his ability to deal with people have become indispensable for the team's growth. But with their professional success also came a distance between them, one that is not immediately noticeable, but that widens like an invisible crack. The mismatched schedules, the dinners cancelled at the last minute, the messages answered late, all of this slowly accumulated between the two of them like a thick fog. Still, none of them verbalized their discomfort, perhaps for fear of confronting the possibility that something was, in fact, changing. At home, there was still affection, there was still touch, there was still desire, but it was as if love needed effort, as if each demonstration of affection was accompanied by a small dose of obligation. Daniel often looked at Laura while she slept and tried to recover in his memory the lightness of his early years, the spontaneous laughter, the weightlessness of words. Laura, in turn, watched Daniel crossing the room with his cell phone glued to his ear and wondered if he still saw her as the same woman as before. Even so, the two continued. They maintained rituals. Friday nights with wine on the terrace, lazy Sundays at the corner cafe, annual holidays somewhere new. They did their best to preserve intimacy, even when the desire seemed tired or the dialogue dragged on already exhausted topics. There was something in common between them that went beyond passion, the sense of construction, the awareness that they were where they were because they had chosen to be together. Laura knew about Daniel's difficulties at work, the pressures he faced, the ambitious projects that demanded more than he could give. Daniel knew Laura's internal dilemmas, the conflicts of self-esteem, the effort to balance career and personal identity in a world where being a woman often meant being less or being too much. Their marriage was, in a way, a fortress built with commitment, but whose walls were already beginning to show signs of wear. Small frictions arose in the most banal moments, the tone of voice in a casual conversation, the annoyance with a silly oversight, the irritation that was previously temporary and now lasted longer than it should have. Nothing serious, nothing that seemed unbearable, but enough to plant silent doubts. And yet, there was love. A love perhaps less brilliant, but profound. A love that resisted the headaches, the stressful meetings, the nights when one slept before the other. A love that, at times, was hidden under layers of routine and tiredness, but that never ceased to exist. Laura was extremely vain in her choices, in the way she dressed, the perfume she wore, the books she read and the conversations she had. She was proud of her independence, but she also valued the care she received from Daniel. On the other hand, there were times when I missed being seen as a woman, not just as a wife or professional. Daniel, in turn, was a pragmatic man, who spoke little about feelings, but showed love with concrete actions, paying a late bill to ease Laura's head, bringing her a chocolate from the supermarket for no reason, renewing her subscription to a magazine she liked. Their love wasn't loud, but it was real. The house where they lived reflected who they were, sober, but cozy. Books scattered around, travel pictures, scented candles and hand-picked utensils. Each room had the stamp of both, Laura's refined taste and Daniel's functionality. It was a space where they had dreamed, laughed, cried. Where they had discussed children, who did not come by mutual choice, and where they celebrated professional victories with toasts to the sound of jazz. That home was a reflection of a story built with effort, and they both knew how hard they had fought to keep everything going. In the workplace, Laura was admired for her firm stance and sense of justice. It was common to see her resolving conflicts between colleagues with almost diplomatic skill. She inspired respect and, at the same time, aroused a certain curiosity. Many wanted to know how she managed to maintain her composure in the face of so many demands and, still, display a calm smile on her face. Daniel was seen as a strategic leader, someone who knew how to make difficult decisions without hesitation. The employees trusted him, but they knew he was not someone easily accessible. There was a constant reserve in his way of acting, as if he were always keeping something for himself. Despite the external demands, both made a point of keeping moments just for themselves. Homemade dinners prepared by hand, weekend getaways without telling anyone, series watched under the blanket in silence. They were gestures that, no matter how simple they were, had the function of keeping the bond alive. But there was a gap that grew silently, a faint feeling that something was out of place, that no matter how hard they tried, they could no longer find themselves at the same time, at the same pace. Laura started coming home later. He alleged last-minute meetings, changes in the agenda, team get-togethers. Daniel, absorbed in his own commitments, did not always question. He took her at her word, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of necessity. I didn't want confrontations, I preferred to trust. And Laura, in turn, clung to the certainty that she was still loved, even when she doubted herself. There was an invisible fracture growing between them, but neither of them dared to look it in the face. They kept moving, as if love was in the constancy of the journey, and not in the clarity of the path. At Daniel's company, a new project was underway, a type of merger between competing groups that required absolute secrecy and extra attention. It was a decisive moment for his career and the future of the company. In the corridors of the firm, there was whispering about possible dangerous alliances, about competitors willing to do anything to gain an advantage. Daniel, aware of the risks, began to distrust everything and everyone, except Laura. She was his anchor, his safe haven, the only space where he still felt whole. And that was exactly why he didn't see what was coming. The most devastating threat did not come from outside, did not wear a suit, nor did he sit at the negotiating table. The greatest threat was subtle, silent, and closer than he could ever imagine. But at that point in the story, he still believed. I still trusted. Still loved. And while the routine took its course, the hurried coffees, the brief smiles, the calculated touches, what was hidden under the veil of stability was already slowly moving to the center of the scene, preparing the ground for what would come later. Because some truths, when they emerge, don't just change history, they destroy it entirely. Laura was increasingly distant. Not with coldness or hostility, but with the subtlety of someone who no longer listens with the same attention or responds with the same lightness. There was something in her eyes, a restrained, almost guilty gleam, that Daniel began to notice in moments when she thought she wasn't being watched. She smiled differently. Smile like someone carrying a secret. At first, he thought it was tiredness. Her work pace had intensified in recent weeks, late-hour meetings, simultaneous projects, corporate events that went on until late. And Laura, always so responsible, made a point of maintaining the appearance of normality. She brought small gifts, said she missed him, and curled up next to him on the sofa as if it were still that inviolable refuge. But there was something. Something wrong. Something I couldn't name. Daniel wasn't the paranoid type, but the details started to scream. A quick exchange of deleted messages on her cell phone, a new perfume that she never used for him, hastily declined calls, and a type of strategic silence that had replaced the light dialogue from before. He tried to push the thoughts away. Tried not to see. Don't listen. Because the idea of doubt was too painful. To think that there was another among them was like bringing a slow blade down on one's own throat. It was easier to convince yourself that you were exaggerating. That Laura was just a busy woman, that he himself had perhaps stopped being the caring man she had known. He began to blame himself in silence, trying to find reasons within himself for that distance. He started coming home early, preparing impromptu dinners, sending messages in the middle of the day just to say he loved her. She reciprocated, but there was an automatic tone to her responses, as if she were fulfilling a role she no longer recognized. It was at this stage that Daniel began to notice the schedules. She would leave early, return later, with excuses that, if they weren't so well rehearsed, would border on the absurd. What gnawed at him most was the fact that Laura still made everything seem plausible. She was still affectionate when she wanted to be, she still said, "I love you," with teary eyes, she still kissed him as if she believed what she was saying. This, perhaps, was the cruelest thing. Until one night, after a particularly exhausting day, Daniel woke up at 3 a.m. with an empty bed next to him. He got up with a knot in his stomach and went to the living room. Laura was sitting on the sofa, in a robe, with her face illuminated by the dim light of her cell phone screen. When he showed up, she quickly locked the device and said she couldn't sleep, that she was just responding to a pending email. Daniel pretended to believe it. But that night, something in him broke. And from then on, something in him woke up. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a kind of bitter lucidity, like someone who finally accepts that something precious has been lost without realizing it. The next day he said nothing. But he began to observe more closely. Not out of blind distrust, but out of survival instinct. He began to remember recent conversations, the names mentioned with unusual frequency, the places she said she was going to, the seemingly innocent details that, added together, told a story he didn't yet know. It was during a dinner with coworkers that an important piece of the puzzle fell into place. One of the unsuspecting wives commented about seeing Laura in an elegant restaurant in the city, not during work, not at a professional event. The woman mentioned the clothes, the laugh, the wine. He said he was with a man, a well-known executive in the industry, and that the two seemed too close to be just negotiating contracts. Daniel smiled, feigned surprise, but inside he felt the ground sink beneath his feet. That night, he did not confront Laura. He didn't show anything. He kissed her when he got home, commented on dinner with the naturalness of an award-winning actor and, when she fell asleep, he spent the entire morning mentally reviewing every gesture of the last few months. The name of the man mentioned was known. An executive, yes. But the competition. A name that, for Daniel, represented more than a threat in the market, it now represented a concrete presence in his personal life. From there, he hatched a plan. A plan that didn't involve immediate revenge or public exposure. But a plan that needed proof, precision. Something definitive. He began collecting information without leaving a trace. He installed discrete software that allowed him to access archived messages, activated tracking systems on equipment that belonged to the company, without ever violating ethical limits, but with all necessary caution. And that's how he began to discover the extent of Laura's involvement. The messages exchanged between her and the man left no room for doubt. They were meetings scheduled with silly codes, shared laughter, desires expressed in words he hadn't heard in a long time. The two had a favorite restaurant, used the same app taxi, and frequented a reserved hotel on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't a one-off thing. It was an affair. A parallel relationship maintained with surgical coolness. The betrayal wasn't just in the body, it was in the continuous choice to hide, to lie, to construct a second reality. Daniel felt the weight of each word like slow stabs, each "I can barely see you again" like a dry slap to the face. But still, he didn't rush. He kept everything. Saved screenshots. He wrote down dates. Organized hidden folders with every detail. Not to destroy Laura, but to know the truth in full. And, mainly, to decide what to do with it. On the outside, everything remained the same. He continued to be the attentive husband, she continued to play the perfect wife. But inside Daniel, the storm was gaining strength. The coldness with which she smiled after an afternoon with someone else, the naturalness with which she kissed his lips while her cell phone vibrated with hidden notifications. He began to observe her eyes more closely. And he saw, for the first time, that the love there hadn't died, it had transformed. In guilt, perhaps. In attachment to stability. Or, perhaps, in fear. Laura looked at him with tenderness, but a tenderness that carried silence. As if they loved what they had been, but no longer had the strength to be it again. It was then that, on a cloudy Thursday afternoon, Daniel decided to bring forward a business trip. I told her I would need to spend 2 days away, in another city. Prepared everything with precision. He changed flights, booked a discreet hotel in the city center and returned the same day, without telling anyone. He knew, from the traces left, that Laura and her lover had dinner scheduled that night. A dinner that was not casual. It was special. It was his birthday, and she had prepared everything. Reserved table, chosen wine, dress, details. And while she smiled via text and confirmed that she was leaving work straight to the restaurant, Daniel was already observing the atmosphere outside. There was no anger. There was a silent kind of mourning. The realization that everything he thought he had was now an illusion. But there was also a cruel lucidity. And it was with this lucidity that he entered the restaurant, with firm steps, dark suit, calm face. He saw the two of them laughing at the table in the background, her eyes shining with an intensity he hadn't seen in months. The man touched her naturally. Laura watched him as if forgetting that there was a world beyond that table. And then she saw him. And the world froze. The smile faded from his lips, his body stiffened, his breathing failed. She said her name, like someone who can't believe what they see. And he, without raising his tone, just replied that he knew. I knew everything. At that moment, there were no more excuses or justifications. Just a look that said it all. A look that ended a story. But what none of them knew, not even Laura, was that the worst was yet to come. Because betrayal, as devastating as it was not the end. It was just the foreshadowing of a much bigger revelation. A truth that still slept under layers of silence and that, when it came to light, would change not only the course of the relationship, but the destiny of everyone involved. The silence after the revelation of the betrayal was not immediate, it was dense. Daniel remained standing in front of the table, watching Laura's face pale in the warm light of the restaurant, as if every cell in her body was trying to understand if this was even real. The lover, visibly disconcerted, slightly moved his chair back as if he anticipated some physical confrontation, but Daniel didn't even look at him. All his attention was focused on her lost gaze, her half-open mouth, the involuntary gesture of reaching for her necklace as if seeking support in something that offered no support. Laura murmured his name in a low voice, trying to smile as if everything could be reversed with a quick explanation, an apology, some absurd justification. But Daniel didn't give him that chance. He just pulled out the empty chair, sat down calmly and placed a small white envelope on the table, with his name written in hand. The lover stood up, saying that perhaps it would be better to give the two space to talk. Daniel looked up for the first time and just said he could stay. That he would also be part of the conversation. And it was then that Laura's face contorted in a mix of terror and confusion, because there, at that moment, she understood that she had lost control. Daniel's serenity was a harbinger of something greater. And when he leaned back in his chair and intertwined their fingers on the table, she realized it wasn't just about cheating. It was about something much deeper. Daniel was not injured. It was decided. He began to speak with deafening calm. He said he wasn't there to discuss feelings, that everything had already been felt, digested, swallowed and expelled. She said she spent weeks in silence, absorbing every detail of what was happening behind his back. Every message, every hotel reservation, every exchange of glances that she believed no one saw. And, finally, he said that a betrayed husband and an unfaithful wife were not sitting at that table. There were 3 adults sitting who needed to face the consequences of their actions. Laura tried to interrupt, tried to say that everything had been a mistake, that she was confused, that she didn't want to destroy anything. Daniel didn't react. He just opened the envelope and took out a set of papers. Laura recognized it instantly: statements, prints, copies of emails. All organized, dated, numbered. Proof of everything. But that wasn't what would change the course of history. Daniel then directly addressed the man, whose name until that moment had barely been mentioned. He said he found it curious how life turned around, and that he would never have imagined that one day he would be face to face with someone who, years before, had tried to sabotage his company with a fraudulent merger proposal. The lover frowned, confused, trying to understand what it was about. Daniel then asked if he really believed that all of that, the meetings with Laura, the compliments at social gatherings, the chances at corporate events, had gone unnoticed. He asked if he really thought that no one had noticed the sudden approach, the veiled interest, the calculated tone of each conversation. And it was then that, for the first time, the other man lost his composure. He tried to laugh, he tried to deny it, he said that it was a ridiculous theory, that he would never get involved in something so dirty, that his relationship with Laura was personal, never professional. Laura looked at him, now as surprised as Daniel had been weeks before. She didn't know. I didn't know about the connection between the two. She didn't know that the man who made her feel special, desired, independent, was the same man who had spent years trying to destroy the legacy of the husband she was now betraying. Daniel then told the rest, that he had discovered the false corporate identity he used, the meetings with the company's smaller shareholders, the attempt to obtain internal information through the access that Laura had to Daniel's professional environment. That there was a plan in progress to devalue the company's image and force an emergency sale that would directly favor the interests of the rival company of which the lover was a silent partner. The silence at the table became suffocating. Laura, now with her face burning hot, looked at Daniel with a mixture of anger, shame and disbelief. She didn't know. She had no idea that the man she had risked everything for was, in fact, someone who already had in mind the destruction of everything she had built alongside her husband. She tried to justify herself, saying that she never talked about the company, that her conversations were intimate, that she would never reveal anything confidential. But Daniel's expression didn't change. He just said that she had already revealed everything she needed to when choosing who to share the bed with. And that, in itself, was betrayal enough. The man, now visibly nervous, said that everything was just speculation, that there was no proof of any connection between his meetings with Laura and any type of action against Daniel's company. But Daniel smiled for the first time. He took a flash drive out of his pocket. He said that there were audios, documents, spreadsheets, financial transactions with hidden names, all linked to contracts signed by private parties and transactions made from the same bank account used to pay for one of the accommodations at the hotel where he and Laura spent one night. He said he didn't need to hand it over to the police yet, not right now. All he had to do was get up, leave and never come back. Because if I did, all that would disappear. But if he insisted, he would be the first name in the newspapers. Laura remained silent, motionless. Eyes teary, breath caught. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. He was faced with a truth he could not deny. I had been deceived. And the worst part, he had let himself be used. Daniel then stood up. He looked at her for a moment, with a look that was not one of contempt, but of goodbye. He said everything they did together deserved more than that. But, unfortunately, she had made irreversible decisions. He said that the betrayal of the body could even be forgiven, but the betrayal of trust could not. That what had been destroyed wasn't just the marriage, it was the sense of truth. And from then on, everyone would follow their own path. The lover tried to say something, but Daniel just raised his hand in silence. He picked up his jacket, looked around as if saying goodbye not to a restaurant, but to an entire life, and walked outside. The sound of the cutlery, the laughter at the surrounding tables, the ambient music, everything seemed distant. Laura remained sitting, unable to react. I didn't know whether to cry, whether to scream, whether to run after him. I just knew that I had lost. And that this loss had weight, it had color, it had a smell. It was the end of a cycle. But what she didn't yet know, what no one knew at that moment, was that the story wouldn't end there. Because Daniel hadn't just said goodbye. He had prepared something bigger. Something that would come like a whirlwind over everything Laura believed she could still rebuild. Something that would change not only their destiny, but the entire structure that existed behind what seemed, until recently, just a marriage in crisis. Laura left the restaurant alone that night. The lover, cornered and without the strength to sustain any type of defense, discreetly disappeared minutes after Daniel left. The waiter even approached asking if she wanted anything else, but she just shook her head and remained motionless, staring at the bottom of the wine glass as if there was some answer there that reality could no longer offer. The shame had a physical weight. It was as if every step, every movement, required twice as much effort from her. Silence was now no longer a choice, it was a punishment. And the knowledge that, in addition to having betrayed someone who once loved her sincerely, she had been used by another man, like a piece in a game she knew nothing about, left her emotionally disfigured. When he arrived home, he entered slowly, as if invading his own space. The soft scent that used to be comforting now sickened her. She took off her shoes in the hall, threw her bag on the sofa and leaned against the wall with her eyes closed, as if she could wake up from all this. But there were no more dreams, only ruin. The next morning, the house looked different. Cold, uninhabited, full of shadows. There was an absence that screamed in the objects, in the cups on the shelf, in the slippers forgotten under the bed. Laura walked through the rooms trying to find any trace of Daniel, any clue that he was still there, or that he had at least hesitated. But everything indicated otherwise. His wedding ring was no longer in the nightstand drawer. The clothes he wore the day before were no longer in the basket. The books I used to read before bed were not on the bookshelf. There was no note, message or any indication that he would return. Laura sat on the edge of the bed and, for the first time since everything had happened, cried silently, without restraint. She cried for everything, for the marriage that she had allowed to fall apart, for the naivety of believing that she could control the game, for the void left by someone who, until that moment, had always been there, even in her absence. On the other side of the city, Daniel had already settled into a temporary flat. I didn't want to go back to the house where everything had collapsed. I didn't want to breathe the same smells, see the same paintings, lie in the same bed. He needed a neutral environment, where he could reorganize his own existence. He spent the night before talking to his lawyer and taking practical steps, blocking joint accounts, removing passwords, formal communication about the separation. There was no hatred in their attitudes. Just brutal clarity. He knew that his dignity did not need shows, but firmness. The next day, he went to work as if nothing had happened. Meetings, emails, decisions. A man who had learned, in the midst of pain, that sometimes surviving means continuing. But inside, even in the face of apparent strength, Daniel felt the shock. Not the betrayal, that had already been digested, but the hidden plot that was finally revealed. He knew he needed to do more than just leave. I needed to close the cycle with integrity. And that meant facing Laura once again, but now on her territory, the house. 2 days later, he returned. The key still worked, but he rang the doorbell. Laura opened the door and froze. She was pale, with deep circles under her eyes, and her face was marked by the lack of sleep. Daniel entered without saying a word. He went straight to the living room, sat down and crossed his hands on his knees. She remained standing, like a student called to the board, awaiting the verdict. He then looked into her eyes and asked, "You know what you did. But I want to understand, why? Why like that? Why with him?" Laura hesitated, bit her lip, walked from side to side as if searching for the missing courage in each step. And then he started talking. She said she didn't know when she started to lose herself, that for a long time she had felt invisible within her routine, that she had missed feeling desired, seen, admired. She said she wasn't justifying it, but that she needed to be honest. That man, at first, appeared as a relief. A breath. A mirror where she could see herself in a different light. And then everything got out of control. That the involvement grew, that she believed she could manage both worlds, that it was something momentary. But she swore, and repeated desperately, that she never revealed anything about the company, that she never touched on confidential matters, that she never imagined that there was another intention behind his interest. Daniel listened to everything with an almost cruel impassivity. When she finished, he just shook his head and stood up. He went to the closet where she kept her work documents. He took out a gray folder, opened it and showed her a specific sheet. A printed report with handwritten observations, her handwriting. It was internal, confidential material that should never have left the company's system. Laura turned pale. He immediately denied it. He said he would never have taken that home. Daniel then pointed to the bottom corner of the page, the digital signature of her own email. He said he had cross-referenced the data and discovered that the attachment was sent from her personal computer 2 weeks earlier. That the recipient was an encrypted email, but that by investigating the IP logs and network permissions, he had discovered the entire path. He said she had been used. That her outbursts were exploited in moments of vulnerability, in moments when she perhaps didn't even know what she was doing. Laura fell onto the sofa, shocked. She murmured that it couldn't be true. That maybe he had used her laptop, that maybe there had been some manipulation. But Daniel cut in with a firmer tone. He said he was no longer there to confront her as a husband, but to inform her as a professional. All of this, if exposed, would constitute a serious security breach. And that he, by choice, had chosen not to pursue the case further. That he had decided not to destroy her image in the company, nor take the family name through the mud. But this would require a price. The divorce would be immediate, without negotiation. She would keep her personal belongings, nothing else. He would pay a fixed amount for 3 months for it to restructure, and after that, everyone would go it alone. Laura tried to get up, but her legs wouldn't obey. He said he didn't want any of that. That she still loved him. That he had made terrible mistakes, but he had no idea that the consequences would be so irreparable. Daniel just replied that love was not enough. That respect was the basis. And once it was broken, it was almost impossible to glue the pieces together. That was the last conversation between the two inside that house. Daniel left without looking back. The next day, Laura received a visit from the lawyer with the papers ready. She didn't object. He signed in silence. His voice choked, his hands trembled. When the lawyer left, she sat on the living room floor, surrounded by boxes of belongings, and cried for everything that was left. Months later, she tried to start again. He changed neighborhoods, changed jobs, and started attending therapy sessions. I wanted to understand how I had allowed everything to be lost like that. Daniel, in turn, dedicated himself even more to his work. But it also gave space for life. He started going out, meeting new people. And in one of these unpretentious meetings, he met someone who didn't judge him by his past, who didn't compare him to what he was. Someone who looked at him with calm admiration, without demands, without specters of guilt. The past, even when healed, never disappears completely. But Daniel learned that there are lives that are born after the end. And that sometimes, a man's greatest strength lies in not retaliating with violence, but in moving forward with dignity. Because there are betrayals that burn inside. But there are new beginnings that illuminate the outside. And in the end, Laura learned the hardest lesson of all: it wasn't just a mistake. It was the wrong choice by the wrong person at the wrong time. And because of that, he lost everything. Including the chance to redeem yourself. The days following the signing of the divorce papers didn't bring immediate relief, but rather a disconcerting feeling of suspension. Laura woke up early, no longer out of obligation, but because her sleep had become shallow and fragmented. His new home was a small rental apartment, furnished with the essentials. Every corner still exhaled the smell of the new, but there was nothing comfortable about it. It was a new thing that wasn't a choice, it was a consequence. The reality there was raw, without the comforts that once seemed a natural part of life. The kitchen was tiny, the living room was stuffy, and the windows, despite the view of the gray sky, seemed smaller than she could handle. The move to that space had been quick, silent, and without goodbyes. Laura didn't warn anyone, didn't seek advice, didn't ask for help. She did everything alone, like a penitent carrying the weight of her decisions. There was no hatred in his gestures, no blatant guilt. There was a muffled, continuous lament that infiltrated everyday actions like sad music in the background. At work, things have also changed. She wasn't fired, but she was gently removed from important projects. The confidence that once surrounded her had been eroded by the subtle rumors, crossed glances, and an atmosphere of discomfort she felt upon entering any meeting. Even without explicit proof, it was enough for her name to be involved in something so delicate for relations to begin to cool. Her teammates, once so close, began to treat her with polite neutrality. And although no one had the courage to ask directly, it was clear that everyone knew that something serious had happened. The feeling of being watched and, at the same time, ignored began to deplete what was left of her self-esteem. Laura continued to come to the office, meet deadlines, deliver results, but she had lost her lightness. His presence, once welcoming, was now surrounded by an awkward silence. At the end of each day, she returned home with the impression that she was just occupying space, no longer belonging anywhere. Meanwhile, Daniel experienced a different kind of emptiness. The rationality with which he had handled the latest events guaranteed him peaceful nights of sleep, but did not free him from abrupt loneliness. The mornings, once shared, were now too silent. The coffee tasted like a mechanic, and the little rituals, like leaving the towel next to her, preparing 2 cups or pulling out the chair at the table, continued to be performed out of habit, even in her absence. His temporary apartment was functional, clean, well located, but cold. He tried to stay active, filling every minute with tasks, with professional goals, with trips. But there were moments, in the gaps of the day, when the weight of what I had lost became inevitable. Daniel didn't miss Laura as a lover, but as a presence. He missed the sound of her in the kitchen, the touch on his shoulders while he read, the discussions about silly things that, deep down, sustained intimacy. He knew he would move on, but he also knew that part of him would be forever stuck in what was, not by desire, but by memory. Life went on, but neither of them could shake the feeling that what had destroyed them had been more than adultery. What really separated them was the breaking of a silent alliance, a trust that had never been verbalized, but which was understood in detail. That was what hurt now, the absence of certainty. Not knowing at what moment everything started to slip, when they stopped really looking at each other, when they started walking along parallel lines that never met. The moral dilemma, now, was no longer in the act itself, but in what each person needed to do with what was left. Laura asked herself every day if it was possible to rebuild herself without forgiving herself. And Daniel, in turn, fought the urge to review his decisions, to find some flaw in judgment, to look for nuances where perhaps there was none else. On a random night, Laura ran into Daniel at a corporate event. It wasn't something planned. Both had been invited via different paths. She, out of professional obligation. Him as a guest speaker. When their eyes met, time seemed to rewind. There was silence amid the hubbub of the room. Laura didn't look away. Daniel hesitated for a second, but then gave a brief, respectful nod. She responded with a shy smile, and the two headed in opposite directions. But all that night, she watched him from a distance. She saw how he spoke with confidence, how he maintained a firm posture, how he smiled politely even when the topic was sensitive. He saw the way people listened to him, how they respected him. And it was there that she understood the dimension of the man she had lost. Not because of betrayal, but because I wasn't able to see him completely at the right time. For having allowed a fleeting desire to become a permanent mistake. Daniel, in turn, noticed that she looked different. There was a weariness on his face that wasn't physical. It was an absence of shine, a slight curvature in the shoulders, a look that no longer sought approval. There was humility there, a silent surrender. And for a moment he wondered if he should approach her, ask how she was, offer a little kindness. But he decided to do nothing. That story already had its outcome in progress. And, at that moment, any gesture could open gaps that no longer had any place. At night, lying in his bed, Daniel reflected on the fine line between justice and compassion. He knew that he had acted correctly, that he had not exposed anyone, that he had protected everything he could. But he also knew he hadn't emerged unscathed. That forgiving was not forgetting. And that moving forward required more than winning. It demanded understanding. In the following days, Laura started visiting her old therapist. Resuming the analysis was, for her, an exercise in humility and also an attempt to reorganize the pieces. The sessions were intense. He reviewed his choices, revisited his childhood story, his relationship with his parents, the emotional models he cultivated. For the first time, he began to understand that betrayal was not born the moment he accepted the first invitation to dinner. It came much earlier. It came from the constant feeling of not being enough, the search for validation, the mistaken idea that being desired was proof of worth. When he understood the root of it all, he began to forgive himself. Not as a way to escape responsibility, but as a necessary step to start over. He discovered, with pain, that the most difficult forgiveness is the one that does not come from the other. Meanwhile, Daniel continued building a new life with firm steps. He received invitations to take on even greater positions in the professional field. Traveled more, met people with similar interests, rediscovered old hobbies. And in one of those events in which life insists on creating the unexpected, he met someone who awakened a kind of dormant attention. There was no passion at first sight, no promises. But there was curiosity, exchange, respect. A kind of peaceful connection he no longer expected to find. It wasn't a replacement. It was construction. They began to meet frequently, talk about books, walk in the park, share silences without the need to fill them. It was something new. And Daniel, for the first time in months, felt that he could believe in love again, not as an escape from the past, but as a real possibility for the future. Time, with its brutal, silent efficiency, was beginning to do its work. But before the story ended, there was still one last choice to be made. A choice that involved no contracts, no resentment, no revenge. A choice that would, in fact, define what each person would do with what was left. Because starting over is not erasing the past. It's knowing how to use it as a foundation for something more true. And to do that, it would take courage. Courage to face not only others, but above all yourself. And decide, in front of your own shadow, if it was still possible to walk towards the light. The reunion was unscheduled, but when it happened, it seemed inevitable. It was on a Saturday afternoon, in a cafe hidden between narrow streets, the kind of place they both used to go to years ago. Laura didn't see him right away, but Daniel noticed her presence as soon as he walked through the glass door. She was sitting alone, with a book open on the table, but her eyes were distant, lost in thoughts that seemed deeper than any narrative. He hesitated for a moment, considered leaving without being noticed, but some invisible force kept him there, standing in front of the counter, watching her with the calm of someone who no longer expected anything, but perhaps just wanted to understand. She looked up and saw him. There was no shock, no surprise, just an instant of silent recognition, as if that moment had been saved to happen. He approached slowly, and she didn't move. Time was no longer on the side of guilt or indignation. It was just present. Daniel sat down after a discreet gesture of consent from her. The waiter approached, he ordered a coffee and the two remained silent for a few seconds. Laura closed the book and took a deep breath. He said he imagined that one day this would happen. He smiled slightly and replied that, deep down, he did too. The conversation started with trivialities, work, changes in the city, mutual friends. But little by little, the surface opened up. Laura mentioned that she was finishing a specialization course in emotional communication, something she had pursued not only for professional growth, but for personal need. He said that the therapy sessions had become a space for reconstruction, where he began to understand not only what he did, but why he did it. Daniel listened attentively, without interrupting. He seemed less rigid, like someone who learned to live with his own pain and no longer needs to defend himself all the time. When she talked about the nights she blamed herself for everything, he just shook his head and said he had his too. That pain doesn't choose sides, that even the innocent bleed. Laura then talked about the day she went into the old house alone to pick up some objects that were left behind. He said that when he touched the walls, he had the distinct sensation of visiting an archaeological ruin of his own life. Who saw the sofa where they slept together for years, the kitchen where they prepared dinners for no reason, and realized that all of that still existed, but it no longer belonged to them. Daniel looked at her with a softer look than he expected. He said he also went through similar grief. That the objects survive, but the stories are what dissolve in time. And that, sometimes, what breaks between two people is not just the bond, but the image they had of themselves within that bond. Laura agreed. She said that for a long time she believed that she was a woman who would never commit betrayal. That this was too clear a line to cross. But then he realized that the lines aren't as visible when we're lost. And when we no longer recognize ourselves, any mistake can seem like a desperate attempt to exist again. Daniel then asked if she was okay. Not as a polite question, but as someone who actually cares. She smiled, with teary eyes, and replied that she was better. That there were still bad days, but now I could see the possibility of good days too. She said she learned to be alone, to listen to herself, not to seek approval all the time. He nodded. He said he believed her. That I saw a change in the way I looked, in the way I spoke. And that, above all, he was happy to know that she was finding herself again. Laura took a deep breath, looked at the street outside and said, almost in a whisper, that she still dreamed of the day when she could look at all of this in peace. Daniel replied that that day would come. Not as a magical forgiveness, but as the result of a journey that was now hers alone. The conversation continued for a while longer, and when they said goodbye, there were no promises or expectations. Just a long, silent hug, which said everything that words could no longer do. That hug didn't ask for anything, it didn't give anything, it just acknowledged. And at that moment, something closed inside them both. Not like a slammed door, but like a cycle that finally came to an end. Daniel returned home and felt neither sadness nor relief. He just felt maturity. A type of serenity that is born when you understand that there is nothing left to say or prove. In the following weeks, Laura followed her path more firmly. She started writing for a small blog, where she shared reflections on reconstruction, self-knowledge and choices. The texts were discreet, but they began to gain loyal readers. People who identified with her pain, who saw in her not a broken woman, but someone who had the courage to remake herself. The comments she received were heartwarming, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was giving something back to the world. Daniel, on the other hand, approached the new relationship with caution, but also with hope. The woman who now accompanied him was sensitive, intelligent and understanding. I didn't want to replace anyone. I just wanted to be there, present, whole, true. And he finally allowed himself to be loved again, without fear of being betrayed, without carrying the weight of the past. But there was still a dilemma that Daniel couldn't solve alone. A confidential document that he still kept in his personal safe. Clear evidence that Laura, even if unconsciously, had contributed to the attempted sabotage of her company. He never used it, never gave it to anyone. But she knew that, if revealed, it could still have serious consequences for her. The doubt was not legal, it was moral. Should you protect the reputation of someone who destroyed your trust? Or should he, finally, ensure that justice is done? The answer did not come immediately. He reflected for days, talked to his lawyer, reread every line of evidence. And then, one silent night, he destroyed the material. Paper by paper, photo by photo, pen drive by pen drive, everything was burned calmly. Not for her, but for him. Because he realized that carrying that secret was a way of keeping himself trapped. And that truly freeing oneself meant giving up even the right to revenge. Laura never knew about this gesture. And Daniel never told. Because certain acts only make sense when they remain silent. And because true victory is not in seeing the other person pay for their mistakes, but in moving forward in peace, without needing revenge. The story between them had ended, yes, but it had left marks that were now beginning to turn into scars. And scars don't hurt forever. They just remember. Time continued to pass, and with it, new chapters were being written. Their lives went in different directions, but with a silent, almost imperceptible connection. The kind of connection that doesn't require presence, just respect. And maybe, deep down, gratitude. Gratitude for everything that was and also for what stopped being. Because some losses are necessary so that we can finally find the most honest version of ourselves. And that's what, without realizing it, they both did. They started again. Not as victims or villains. But as people. Imperfect, regretful, courageous. Capable of loving again, of loving yourself again. And, above all, capable of forgiving. Even without forgetting. Even without coming back. 2 years have passed since their last conversation, and in that time life has tried to do what it does best, move forward. Laura never saw him again, nor did she try. She understood that any attempt at reconnection would be selfish, because even if forgiveness existed, the presence would always be a living reminder of what was lost. She continued rebuilding her life with firm, although often lonely, steps. The texts I wrote turned into something bigger than I imagined. The small blog grew, gained space, readers, and became a book that toured bookstores with a strong and sincere title, The Weight of Silence. The content was raw, without flourishes, a visceral account of someone who went through guilt, shame, emptiness and still found a way to breathe again. She did not consider herself a victim or a heroine. She was only human. And maybe that's why it touched so many other people. Laura started to be invited to lectures, women's meetings, and conversation circles. He never told his story in detail, never revealed names. He just shared feelings, choices, consequences. Little by little, he gained a new purpose. She, who at some point felt lost within herself, now helped others find themselves. I still felt the weight of pain at specific moments, like when I heard certain music, or passed by places that were important, but I learned to embrace that pain as part of what it means to be whole. It didn't erase the past. Reorganized it. And this process made her more sensitive, more aware, stronger. He never got involved in relationships like before. She went to therapy for a long time until she understood that she needed to be whole first and then allow herself to be divided. And when someone finally arrived, she no longer expected to be saved. It was ready to build. Truly. With limits. With conscious choices. Daniel, on the other hand, became something even greater than he planned for himself. Your company prospered, expanded borders and reinvented itself. But more important than that was the peace he began to cultivate in his life. Over time, he bought a house in a quiet area, surrounded by trees, with large windows through which the sun came in without asking for permission. There, he started again with the woman he had met shortly after the end. They didn't run. They gave it time. She didn't want a man in pieces and he didn't just want a replacement for an empty one. And that made all the difference. With her, Daniel discovered that it is possible to love again without repeating mistakes, without fear, without strings attached. The past has not become a taboo among them, but a respected territory. It was mentioned when necessary, without open wounds, just as part of the baggage they both brought. They were both mature, serene, determined. And they decided to build a life together where admiration was the basis. Loyalty clause. The affection, constant. The lover who was a key player in the downfall of that marriage suffered silent but devastating consequences. After the veiled scandal and sudden breakup with Laura, he was discreetly removed from the company he worked for. There was no public exposure, but corporate behind the scenes are quick to spread the truth. Little by little, he saw doors close, contracts evaporate, and the image of trust he had cultivated for years being eroded beyond repair. He tried to reinvent himself in another state, opening his own business, but he no longer had the same charisma. There was something about his presence that betrayed instability. His career never recovered in the same way, and, even though he blamed others, deep down he knew that it was a direct consequence of his choices. A reputation is like glass, once cracked, no matter how hard it sticks, it will never be the same. One day, on a rainy morning, Daniel received a letter. Handwritten, no return address. He immediately recognized the handwriting. He read in silence, sitting on his porch, with a cup of tea in his hands. The letter did not ask for forgiveness. It was a thank you. She just said that, as painful as the separation was, it saved her. That his gesture of not destroying her image, of choosing not to retaliate even though he was right, completely changed the way she saw the world. That, if today she was someone capable of inspiring other women, it was because he had allowed it with his decision. The letter ended by saying that she did not expect a response. I just needed him to know. Daniel read to the end, folded it carefully and put it in the box where he kept small memories that were once great. He didn't smile, he didn't cry. He just closed his eyes for a few seconds, took a deep breath and went back to writing in the notepad open on his lap. It was a new project, something about integrity, leadership and humanity. Because, in the end, that was what he had become, a whole man. The story that began with a hidden dinner ended with a cycle closed with dignity. Everyone lost something, but everyone gained awareness. None of them emerged unscathed, but they all emerged transformed. Because betrayal, while devastating, can be the breaking point needed to reveal who we really are when everything falls apart. The question that remains is not why it happened, but what we do after it happens. And in this story, all the paths chosen after the fall were the ones that truly defined who each person was. Now we want to know, what did you think of this story? Which character touched you the most? Which attitude surprised you the most? Comment your opinion below. We really want to know how you experienced each part of this intense and real narrative. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell and share this video with anyone you believe needs to reflect on the consequences of their own choices. And remember, this channel does not support, under any circumstances, any type of betrayal. Here, we tell fictional stories so that people understand, in a profound way, how infidelity can destroy lives, homes, plans and, above all, hearts. Until the next story.